The Beach Boys live in Chicago in 1968 with a song called Little Bird. That track, featured on the group's album of that summer, Friends, saw drummer Dennis Wilson spreading his wings, so to speak, and becoming more involved with the Beach Boys as a songwriter. Dennis also inadvertently kicked off the group's tenure as ambassadors for the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who had only recently introduced the Beatles to transcendental meditation. Unlike the Fab Four, who labored over their TM-inspired magnum opus for months on end before releasing the White Album in November of 1968, the Beach Boys, well, they struck while the iron was hot and released the Friends album in June. At the time, the album Friends sank without a trace, but over time, it's now widely regarded as one of the band's most interesting records and remains a favorite of their leader, Brian Wilson. Here to discuss the album and the events surrounding it is our friend David Beard, editor of Endless Summer Quarterly magazine. David, welcome back to the show.
As always, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's our pleasure. And when last we spoke, the Beach Boys had released their Wild Honey album, which was this raucous R&B-influenced garage rock record. And now with the Friends album, we have this peaceful and tranquil, meditative collection of songs. Tell us how we get to this point.
I think you have to begin with December 15th, 1967, when the Beach Boys were a part of the UNICEF Variety Gala at the Olympia, I'm going to say this wrong, Quattro Tricks.
No, that's good.
I can see it, but I can't say it. In Paris, France, the really wild, eclectic variety show. You know, it had Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. It had Marlon Brando,
right,
and his dancers. And what's really, really unique about this, not just for the Beach Boys, but in the front row was Maharishi, and sitting on either side was George Harrison and John Lennon. Maharishi, at this time, because the Beatles got into transcendental meditation, his celebrity was kind of on the rise. And so here they are at this UNICEF event, and during the sound check for this big gala, the Beach Boys, Dennis first, meets the Maharishi. And he then makes it a point to make sure the others meet him. And at the show, of course, is Bruce Johnston, Carl Wilson, Al Jardine, and Dennis, and Mike Love. And so they meet him, they go on to perform it. It's a really interesting set they do, too. It's a short set, but, you know, they perform Barbara Ann, God Only Knows, and there's another one that's I'm not thinking of. But they close off their set with Oh Come All Ye Faithful. It's just a gorgeous performance of the song. That night, you know, you've got this eclectic group of people. Mike ends up going off with Marlon Brando for the evening and partying with him. And, Mike Love and Marlon Brando, go figure. It's actually in Mike's book. So Mike ends up in London, I think, as do the other members. And Mike gets a phone call the next day, and it's Dennis. And Dennis is still in Paris. He's the only one of the group that stayed back. And he tells Mike, hey, you've got to come back to Paris. Maharishi is going to teach us TM. And Mike said, are you sure? So Dennis hung up, checked, called Mike back, and he goes, yeah, I'm sure. You got to come back to Paris. So the guys are back in Paris on Sunday, December 17th, and that's when they receive their mantras from Maharishi. Now, for those who don't know, when you begin to practice transcendental meditation, you receive your mantra on the first day, but there's 4 days in a row that you have to see your teacher. So what happened was the Beach Boys received their mantras, but then they went their separate way with Maharishi, but they still had to complete their learning TM. So they go back to Los Angeles, and they end up finishing off the following 3 days with Helen Lutz. And Helen and Charles Lutz were a couple that knew Maharishi. They worked with Maharishi, and they ran a Spiritual Regeneration Movement Foundation in Los Angeles. And it was around that same time, I believe December 67, no one has the exact date, but I spoke to Mike. I did a recent interview with Mike for the next ESQ, and also Brian's first wife, Marilyn Wilson Rutherford, and she told me that I provided the name Helen Lutz, and because she didn't initially remember the name, but once I said the name, she said, I think that's exactly right. Brian and Marilyn received their mantras from Helen Lutz.
I see.
And Brian finishes his course with Helen, as does Marilyn. And as 1968 rolls around, late January, the guys encourage Brian to go with them to New York, and visit the Plaza Hotel. And Brian meets Maharishi for the first time. And Brian isn't quite sure, and this is from Marilyn, she was there. He's not quite sure what to make of the guy because he's a little different, right, visually.
Right.
And he's kind of a holy man, So Brian was a little, I don't know if freaked out's the right word, but he just wasn't sure how to act or behave around a guy who was considered holy. So they're now all practicing. They come back to Los Angeles, but Mike stays behind. So the rest of the guys go back to L.A. And Mike then goes from New York to Boston, where Maharishi goes. And Maharishi gives another lecture.
Right.
And it's at that point that Mike actually ends up calling Maharishi's room, and Maharishi picks up the phone. Mike introduces himself over the phone and says, hey, it's me, Mike Love of the Beach Boys. And Maharishi just says, are you coming to India? And Mike says, well, I don't I don't know how the conversation went, but Mike was unaware that there was a trip to India. And upon the conversation, he said, you can bring your friends, meaning the other Beach Boys, because he had given them mantras, right?
Right.
So Mike says, well, I don't know about the others, but I'll be there. So Mike goes back to L.A. and within a week's time has some new clothes made, some like tailor clothes made, packs his bags, and he's gone. Now, the funny thing about that trip was Mike was unaware that he just thought it was to go to India and learn more about transcendental meditation and practice it.
Right.
And it turns out it was actually a teacher training program. In other words, what happens if you're going to become a teacher in transcendental meditation, at least today, I don't know how it was structured then, is you go away for 5 months. And once he got there, he just did the best he could to meditate and kind of listen to the Maharishi's lectures and get the most benefit out of that trip that he could possibly get. And it turned out to be quite an event, because now it's quite historical all these years later, because the Beatles were there, and Donovan and Mia Farrow.
Right.
And, so that was by accident. He didn't know the Beatles were going to be there. Maharishi just said to him, are you coming to India, and do you want to bring your friends? That was the extent of it.
Yeah, well, it turned out to be fortuitous for both Mike and the Beatles, because Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison were in India writing songs when they weren't meditating, and Paul McCartney was working on this parody of Chuck Berry's Back in the USA, but set in Russia, and he asked Mike for his opinion of the song, and Mike suggested adding a bridge that was done in kind of a Beach Boys style, where he would list all the great-looking girls all around the Soviet Union, and it became Back in the USSR.
People were searching, the artist, historically, you go back and look through music history, you could argue that a lot of the drug use was trying to find a new plateau, a new area of creativity, wanting to expand oneself. And the thing about drugs is they wore off. And depending on who you were, when they wore off, you may not be the same person. Meditation offered something that did not wear off. It offered something that you could continue to do. And with transcendental meditation, you go within. So while Mike is in India, the guys are, you've got Brian, Carl, Al, Dennis, and Bruce back in L.A. at either Brian's house on Bellagio or in the ID Sound Studios. Those are the two places that the Friends album recordings took place. The first song that's done for the album is Little Bird. And there was a middle part of that had the word strife, because it came from a poem that Steve Kalinich wrote at Dennis's house. And a little bit about Steve Kalinich. He had what he called a stillness practice. In other words, it was not transcendental meditation. It was just a form of meditation that he called a stillness practice. And the Beach Boys liked that. and what had happened was initially, because if you go back to '67, they had formed Brother Records, and they were signing acts, and Steve Kalinich was signed to Brother Records as a part of a group called, I hope I said this, Zarathustra and
Son?
I knew I was going to mess up the name, and this is true. Let me try it one more time.
Go ahead.
Zarathustra and Thalibius. Yeah, Thalibius.
Okay.
Zarathustra and Thalibius, and it was Stevie and a guy named Mark Lindsay Buckingham. Not the guy who went on to Fleetwood Mac.
Right, or Mark Lindsay of Paul Revere and the Raiders.
Right, so
Right.
Mark Lindsay Buckingham. So it was those two guys, and they were kind of, when they were signed to Brother Records, they were looked at kind of as a Simon and Garfunkel thing.
Right.
They never found legs as a duo, but the guys liked Stevie so much, and they loved that he was into meditation. They liked his energy.
Well, he's writing with Dennis. I guess he's at Dennis's house.
Well, Dennis was actually taking a shower. Stevie wrote it on Dennis's piano. Dennis came downstairs from the shower. He looked at it. Stevie left for the day, and Dennis called him that night and said, and had already, by sitting at the piano, come up with, what we kind of know, the early beginnings of what we know Little Bird to be.
Right.
And he said, I just got a problem with this word strife. So they worked it out, and they got that word out. And then as they started to record it, Brian heard something. He comes in with the whole bridge. And there's a break. There's this gorgeous. There's the cellos and the horns. If you listen to Little Bird, there's cellos and a horn. That's all Brian. It's all Brian. And the reason there's no writing credit on the album to Brian is he didn't want any. As best I can tell, based on what I've been told, is he wanted to let Dennis kind of have his moment or shine, however you want to phrase it. It's almost a nurturing. It's almost a brother nurturing thing that's going on here. And I think, and I don't think I'm too far off the mark here, I think that's because they're all practicing meditation.
Well, before we take a break, let's hear another song by Dennis Wilson and Stephen Kalinich. We were talking about Stephen's stillness practice before, so this is clearly inspired by that. This is called Be Still. So while Mike is away in India with the Beatles and Donovan and Mia Farrow and her sister Prudence and everybody else, the rest of the group stay behind for various reasons, family commitments, what have you, but they begin working on this TM-inspired LP. Now, we already talked about Little Bird, so I don't know where you want to go next with this.
Well, I'll kind of take you through... we've done typically in the past, what we always do is we go in order of how the songs appear on the album. And I'm going to mix it up a little bit today, and I'm going to kind of take you through the order that these songs were done in.
All right, so Little Bird is that the first?
Yeah, that was the first one, and that was done at Brian's home studio off Bellagio. And the next song they work on is Friends. And this is March 13th when they do this, and this one's done also at Brian's home studio. Now, this is an interesting one. I was listening to sessions of this song, and this is... we need to state this first and foremost. This is really, it is a group effort, and we'll talk a little bit about that because the other guys are writing here with Brian and whatnot, but this is Brian's album. The reason it's so peaceful and gentle and peculiar and odd at times in some of these songs we'll talk about is because this is Brian. And I think the result of what we're hearing here, there's two things going, and I was talking about this. One is the meditation, when we started our conversation. What came together? What was the fabric of what made this album? One was the meditation, and the other was Brian's influences at the time. And he had a way, and we know this just from all the previous Beach Boys albums that came out before, Brian had a way of taking a certain style of music, whether it be jazz or R&B or Baroque or what have you, kind of making it his own. And he does that truly on this album. And I think the guy's name was Antonio, Joe Beam?
Antonio Carlos Obim, right, the bossa nova sound.
And there's a lot of, what you can hear on this album is a lot of that style.
Yes. Also, with this song and several others later on, Brian seems to be entering this kind of waltz period. Friends is a waltz, Be Here in the Morning is a waltz, then later on I Went to Sleep, and Time to Get Alone.
The 3/4. Yeah.
The Beach Boys with the title track from their Friends album of 1968. We're talking with David Beard once again. And so that's the second song recorded. Where was that in the timeline?
That's March 13th. Now, the recording started before that, but the dates I'm giving you are when the masters are mixed. So,
right.
And they're bringing things together. The next song they did is When a Man Needs a Woman. That's March 18th.
Right,
Monday.
Not to be confused with the Percy Sledge When a Man Loves a Woman. That's a totally different song.
No, completely different song.
Yeah.
So When a Man Needs a Woman, there's lyrics that he makes. When a man needs a woman, they make things like you, my son. And I asked Marilyn Wilson Rutherford about this, and I said, well, was it because the word son flows much better than the word daughter would lyrically, because that would sound clunky? And she said, well, first off, we didn't know whether it would be a boy or girl. And that was one thing. And then you also have to consider Brian was one of three boys.
Right.
So he only knew the language. It was kind of more or less he just knew the language son. He wasn't thinking daughter.
Well, he had a 50-50 chance, really.
Well, that's
speaking of a population explosion, is there a reason why this little song has 6 writers' credits on it?
I don't know the reason, but I think you could surmise that that's who was in the room.
Yeah.
Brian, on some of these cuts, is using names that haven't been involved before. Well, we'll get to this song in a minute, and the writing credits on this album are very interesting. They are, because when you get to Diamond Head, it's very interesting, because it's mostly the studio cats and Brian. So that's interesting.
What's the next cut?
The next cut they worked on was Passing By, which I understand had lyrics written later. That's just kind of it's a wordless. You can't call it an instrumental,
right? Yeah, they're singing on it.
It's just Brian.
It's just Brian. It's pleasant. It's very pleasant, though. Yeah.
Yeah. So then you have Busy Doing Nothing, and originally this was called Even Steven when it was, I think, just in its initial working form. Brian always gave songs when he started out.
Well, here's your Antonio Carlos Jobim stuff for your bossa nova right here.
Yeah.
And lyrically, the song Busy Doing Nothing gives instructions, or directions on how to get to Brian's house, provided you know where to start.
That was the trick.
Right. And it also gives a nice little explanation of his method for remembering phone numbers. These are very unusual topics to put into a song and to put on a record and release. Brian has always been guileless. He's not really thinking in terms of, I have to impress people, I have to maintain this layer of cool. This is, an incredibly genuine and honest song that everybody would relate to, but not everybody would have the thought to put it on an album.
Exactly, and the album as a whole is a stop and smell the roses. Appreciate the little things in life.
What was next on the roster here?
Next, and we should say that I'm Busy Doing Nothing. If you listen to that song, what's really wonderful about it is Marilyn Wilson doubling Brian on the lead and on backing vocals. And she's on several tracks, uncredited, unfortunately.
Right.
But Wake the World is next. And this is a really wonderful song. It's probably, out of the whole collection, I'd say you've got Meant for You, Wake the World, Annalie the Healer, Little Bird, Be Still, and then the song Diamond Head I love, but it doesn't really speak to the meditation vernacular, but Transcendental Meditation. Those songs by themselves send a message. And the message it's not a cryptic message, it's the Beach Boys saying, hey, this is where we think it's at, which is peace and love and harmony. And again, I gotta just reiterate this. If you listen to this album, the Beach Boys are so in sync with one another.
Right, and the harmonious atmosphere must have been so palpable that the Wilsons' father, the ever controversial Murray Wilson, was invited to sing on a track. He sings on "Be Here in the Morning."
Right. So "Be Here in the Morning" is March 31st, which explains Mike's writing credit. So he's back by that point. He just gets back. And Mike's vocal is added on April 1st or later for Wake the World. So Murray Wilson is actually on there. He sings the background vocal. He's not discernible. You can't really...
I can't hear him at all because I think of him with this gruff voice, but maybe he was a little more flexible with his vocal talents than I knew, but he's in there somewhere.
Yeah, it's just a part. He's like a bass. They probably doubled Mike with him.
Yeah.
You know,
What was the next cut?
Meant for You. Mike has just come back, and in a few days' time, he co-writes Meant for You. He co-writes Transcendental Meditation with Brian and Al, and brings Annalie the Healer, who was actually a German woman who was a part of that whole Rishikesh experience that he was a part of. And she had healing hands. And that's April 2nd. And then Be Still, which is unique that Little Bird's the first one, and here on the very tail end you have Be Still, and that's April 3rd. Likely April 3rd. We don't have the exact date on that. And the information I'm providing you with comes from sessionographer Craig Slawinski, which I'll be including in the issue.
And we should point out that a lot of these songs are like a minute 20, a minute 30. I mean, this is a very short album.
Yeah, it's only 25 minutes long, and Meant for You is 38 seconds. So it was only intended to be an introductory piece.
Right.
So then you have Transcendental Meditation.
Can we talk about that song for a second?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's a strange song for me because here you have the song entitled Transcendental Meditation, yet musically it's this cacophonous jazz. So I don't know if there's humor involved with this or what was the intention here.
Well, I kind of pointed that out to Mike.
Okay.
I just said that, if one were to think of the Friends album in the way that I was thinking, that it's very peaceful, it's a kind of a meditative album, it's very spiritual, to have the song Transcendental Meditation in title at the end makes perfect sense, but the nature of the song itself doesn't fit with the rest of the songs.
Right.
And he had, as a co-writer, I thought his take on this was pretty interesting. Here's what he said. It's pretty dynamic, just the way the song came together. In a way, meditation is pretty peaceful practice, but it's also a preparation for activity, and sometimes your activity is very dynamic. Transcendental Meditation, the song, is a counterbalance to all the serene and peaceful thought recordings. There is a dynamic aspect that Maharishi called the outer stroke of activity. There's the inner stroke of transcending and the outer stroke of activity. I think the song Transcendental Meditation is an outer stroke type song. It's more dynamic and powerful in that way. So Mike's feeling and perspective on that track is that the reason it is the way that it is it's you're going back out into the world.
I am so glad we're having this conversation, David, because this song has been a mystery to me.
Well, I don't know if that's solved the mystery, but at least
it's making perfect sense now because you're surrounded by all this cacophony, and you're sort of dealing with it by meditating. Now, finally, after all these years, after 50 years, it's making sense. So I'm glad that you asked him.
I had to, because it's just so. I've been tempted through the years, once you can make playlists with iTunes and stuff, you just take that off, and then you just have peaceful music.
Right.
That makes more sense. But, and full disclosure, I guess we should tell the listeners, I practice Transcendental Meditation. So
yes.
So I have a little bit of, I don't know if the right word's insight, I have an appreciation for that perspective.
Transcendent.
So that's kind of this album. Now the album...
Well, we didn't talk about Diamond Head.
Well, that was the last song that was recorded for the album. And it's an instrumental, and I was just listening to it, and I love it. I love it a lot.
It's fantastic. It sounds like something that could have fit on Smile. It could have been a nice companion piece to The Nearest Faraway Place on 2020. I mean, it's just a fantastic instrumental and one of the best.
Yeah, no. When I spoke to Marilyn about it, keep in mind, number one, this was the last song recorded for the album. Marilyn's husband Daniel has a test pressing of this album, Friends, and in the test pressing, and he doesn't know the date, or he can't say that it was the proposed album before it came out, but he does have it, and Good Vibrations is in place of, I think he said he wasn't sure, but I think it's in place of Diamond Head. And so if this was intended, if this was Capitol's intention, I could see Brian saying no, and I can see Brian creating Diamond Head to replace it, because he didn't see the point of including Good Vibrations, because that was not the intent of the album.
Sure. It had already come out, so
hard to say. What we do know is Capitol put out Best of Volume 1, 2, and 3, as the Beach Boys were trying to kind of move forward in life, and with their creativity, whether it be R&B or whatever it was, they just were moving in their own direction. And if you listen to it in the beginning, it sounds just like they recorded some chairs on a stack being pushed across a cement floor or something.
Right.
I can't quite tell what that is.
Well, this is probably why you have the studio musicians getting a writer's credit on some of this stuff.
But you've got this Hawaiian guitar, and then that would be the other interesting thing is let me look here, see if I can tell you what Brian played. See, Al Vescovo played guitars and lap steel, Lyle Rich, and these guys are, writing credits.
Yeah.
Ukulele, Brian percussion, it's got a question mark there. Jim Ackley, guitar, question mark. So this was done at ID Sound, and it was done in 3 hours. So this was Brian completing the album after the Beach Boys had already left to go on tour.
Right.
I don't have the information to say why it was recorded. We don't have the information to say, was it recorded in place of, because Capitol was asking for Good Vibrations. But what we do know is that it was the last song that was recorded, and we do know that it ended up on the album. And we do know that it's a cool track.
So the album is released on June 24th, 1968, and
it tanked in the U.S., and you could see where Brian invested himself, put his time and energy into this work, and it's great work. One should not decide whether or not it's of value based on its chart success. And unfortunately, Brian was surely looking at Billboard.
Sure.
And when he saw the album did not do well, I think it went to 126 or something.
It did better in Britain, but in America.
Went to 13 over there.
Yeah.
But here it did poorly, and I don't think Brian was looking at the British trades. He was looking at Billboard, if anything, and saw how poorly it did. It didn't even break the 100, the 100 mark, and that had to be disheartening to him. It probably hurt him emotionally that, oh gosh, what if I don't have it anymore? Or,
Well, here's something really personal that I've just put out, and it's being rejected on a mass scale,
Yeah, worse than Pet Sounds, right? Worse than Pet Sounds.
Right, yes.
And that had to be kind of that reciprocal feeling that he had when Pet Sounds was initially released, because remember, even in 68, there were those people like the Beatles or whoever were telling him how great Pet Sounds was. So at least, even though it didn't become a number one thing, he had this kind of critical artsy appreciation thing going on that people were digging him. And by 68, the Beach Boys had kind of drifted off the map because he didn't really smile, so he wasn't in vogue anymore. Brian Wilson was not, he hadn't lost his ability by any stretch of the imagination, but he wasn't in vogue as he had been.
And it's a strange thing, because Mike was just with the Beatles in India, which was a pretty high-profile trip.
Yeah.
And, the Beach Boys were to go on tour with the Maharishi, and it's almost as if things were happening so quickly.
By June of 68, when this album finally comes out...
Yes.
There's rioting. There's...
Sure.
So much unrest. And, I think the Beach Boys had the right idea. Mike Love had the right idea. Yeah, I can say Mike because Mike is the one who said, let's set up this tour where Maharishi opens for us. But again, if it's not for Dennis Wilson, that conversation doesn't happen.
Right.
So, again, it may be in Mike's brainchild because he went to India, but it's because of Dennis. And so here, and the guys are all about it. They're absolutely, let's do it. Now, I don't know what Bruce's feelings were. We don't know that. But the general consensus was, yeah, let's do it. Because maybe we can bring peace by having Maharishi open for us. Maybe we can bring peace to the world. Maybe we can slowly, concert after concert, get people to meditate. They're going to leave after the show in a better place.
They had the right message. It was just too dark a time for whatever reason.
Yeah, and I don't know when you could legitimately... I don't know how you could have legitimately sold that package, even in a great time. Because no concert goers would not want to pay money to go see a group that you plan to stand on your feet and throw a beach ball around to... You know what I mean?
Yes.
The Beach were known for beach songs, and even if the Friends album had done well, that would have entailed like the mass public all getting into transcendental meditation to go to these concerts to really be able to legitimately meditate.
Well, I mean, similarly in 1974, George Harrison had his Dark Horse tour, and he had Ravi Shankar open up playing sitar music, and that didn't go over well with the crowds. Yeah, who were, you know, we want to see a rock and roll show. Let's talk about the cover as we start to wrap this up and get into some news. But the cover is an illustration featuring the 6 Beach Boys. This is good because in the past we've been missing Beach Boys on album covers for the longest time. So we have all 6 of them here, and then we have faces in the clouds or in the panorama.
Mm-hmm. I love it. I love it for a cover. I can remember the first time I got this album. I know the first time I got the album, it was those twofers that was put out years later that were in just the beige jackets.
Yes, yeah.
So I didn't know what the artwork looked like at all. But when I actually ended up getting the original Friends album in capital sleeve, and I looked at this artwork, I thought, is that Jan and Dean on either side of the guys in Bush format? Because it looks like Jan Berry on the right, and it looks like Dean on the left. At least I thought so. And over time is the guy. We actually include that in the next issue. There's a picture of the guy, how he looks now. Dave McMacken, I guess is. Let me see. I got his name right here. David McMacken. Yeah. So Malcolm Searles, who's done a great job online. If you're listening, Facebook, you can download his stuff for free. It's all about the different Beach Boys album covers. So we include some history about the album art from the album artist himself and get some background. And there was never any intent to make any particular one of these clouds or whatever look like someone specific. It was just like taking pictures of the Beach Boys and putting them in bush and cloud format and kind of just letting it be. And it's interesting to note this middle picture of the Beach Boys, if you look at it, this is a kind of I don't know what the right word is, kind of a Frankenstein painting that goes back to their famous '66 photo where they're at a fence rail.
Yes.
The one that is puzzling to me that just does not look like him is Carl, and he's actually right next to Mike.
Now I thought that was Brian initially.
No, but if you go back to that 1966 photo.
So Brian is actually next to. Well, it's hard to tell.
And Brian is between Al and Bruce.
There's always some controversy with these covers. ESQ, obviously, Friends is a big part of it.
Well, it's almost the entire issue.
Yeah,
but it's a true timeline of everything we've discussed. We're talking about an album that was the result of a movement, a kind of a worldwide movement.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just Maharishi. Maharishi was kind of at the front of it, is in terms of the celebrity, someone that could put the face with the name to the trend. But transcendental meditation was beyond Maharishi. It was something that was really catching on because people were looking for the opposite of turmoil. People were looking for something that would last, that was important in their lives, that would bring them peace, that would bring them, that would slow things down. Because 1968 historically was a mess. Everything from the Vietnam War to the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, In my interview with Mike Love, he told me about how he had the television set on and, he's in his home, and the news of the assassinations and everything, he was crying in front of the TV. But this album, Friends, is the antidote. And the interviews that I've conducted with Mike Love, Marilyn Wilson Rutherford, Steve Kalinich, Alan Boyd, and Mark Lynette streamed together a really kind of well-balanced, conscious telling of everything that was going on, and in a way that I don't think has ever been done before. Where would people go to get the latest information about this latest issue of Endless Summer Quarterly and possibly to subscribe? Well, the easy place is to go to Facebook. Just type in Endless Summer Quarterly. There you're going to see our Facebook page. And if you click on the About button, that will give you all the website information. But the website is esquarterly.com, which is ESQUARTERLY.com. And we're behind schedule, but in the process of getting a new site up. The Facebook page is just it's online social media representation, more or less a page that is a place on social media to share what the other Beach Boys are posting and to show you what our covers look like and show you what we're up to. But it's a physical 48-page publication. It's digest size, and the interviews that you get inside are not going to be anywhere else on the face of the earth. Not in a social media platform, not anywhere. And so that's it.
David, thanks so much as always, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Thanks for having me on.